To gain a better understanding of the American War of Independence, we have to briefly set sail to the other side of the Atlantic and understand what was happening in Europe in the 18th century. The 18th century was witness to a major power imbalance in Europe. Why is it so? The European nations that had huge resources and power had already set sail to colonize new lands across the world. This often led to conflicts and clashes among these nations. Along with that, many European nations were also involved in century-long turmoils. What are those nations? For instance, we can see Britain and France, Prussia and Austria, Portugal and Spain. They have been involved in political turmoils since ages. It was at this juncture that people felt that one final decisive war was needed to understand which country in Europe will gain supremacy not just over the other European nations but also over the world. This, what I said, can be considered the fountainhead of the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War initially broke out as a conflict between Britain and France as they were struggling for supremacy in Europe. But eventually other European nations also got involved in this war to make this a huge prolonged war. Which country joined which side, do you know? On Britain's side there were Prussia, Portugal and Hanover, and on the French side there were Austria, Sweden, Spain and Russia. Together these nations got involved in this long war that came to be known as the 7 Years' War. But how did this war spread to other continents across the world? As you know, Britain and France were both colonial countries. What does that mean? That means that they had their colonial possessions spread out all across the world. When Britain and France got involved in this war almost invariably got spread to other halves of the continents. What happened? This 7 Years' War eventually spread out to Asia and the Americas. The war spread to the Americas and India. In Asia, Britain had its colonial holdings in India, which is why the war spread out to India. But what happened on the Western Front, as in what happened in North America? Since Britain and France both had colonial possessions in North America, the northern half of the continent became embroiled in this war. The northern half of the continent became a full-fledged battlefield. The 7 Years' War, as the name suggests, happened between 1756 and 1763. So after a prolonged period of fighting for 7 whole years, this 7 Years' War came to an end. What was the outcome of it? France was defeated in the 7 Years' War. The Treaty of Paris that was signed in 1763 officially brought this war to a close. Let us now understand in detail the consequences of the 7 Years' War. The Treaty of Paris officially stated that France had to give up its colonial possessions in North America, which is why the French moved back to France, giving up their colonial holdings. But what happened to the French territories? These colonies almost invariably came under the control of Britain and Spain. But while this war meant a momentous victory to Britain and its allies, it was also economically devastating. Britain lost a lot of soldiers to the war. Along with this, the amount of money, the resources that Britain needed to replace new soldiers or provide the soldiers with basic weapons and ammunitions or provide the soldiers with basic resources for their maintenance and sustenance was huge, and this caused a drying up of the British treasury. What did this cause? This caused huge political upheaval in the British Parliament. It was at this juncture that the British Parliament realized that the amount it got from trading with the New World colonies was much less when compared to the amount it needed to defend its colonies in the New World, as you can see. What was the outcome of this? The British government realized that it should devise some strategy, some idea to somehow make up for the immense and huge war expenses. As we talked about the idea that the British government thought of to make up for the immense expenses, can you tell me what that idea was? The British government thought of imposing taxes on its territorial holdings in North America. But does that not sound unfair to you? Most definitely, because the North American colonies did not even have a say in the war. They did not participate in the war, nor were they of the opinion that Britain should go and wage war against France. Then why should taxes be imposed on them? Why should they have to pay taxes to make up for the war expenses? Since this taxation was very unfair, this came to be known as the quote-unquote unfair taxation of Britain. But to understand in detail what this unfair taxation of Britain was, we have to see which products were taxed. The stamp tax was the first tax that the British government imposed on its colonial holdings in North America. What was the stamp tax? It was the Stamp Act of 1765 that stated this stamp tax. What did this stamp tax mean? This tax meant that all sorts of printed materials were supposed to be taxed. What were these printed materials? These printed materials could range from legal documents, papers, newspapers, certificates, bonds, even children's books and playing cards. This is very unfair, isn't it so? Here on the picture you can see that the colonists are reading with great shock and surprise the Stamp Act. Why is it so? Had this tax been imposed on them by their own colonial government, this still could have made some sense. But the British government that was sitting miles and miles away was imposing this sort of an arbitrary tax on them. This enraged the colonies. They realized that this was an unfair tax imposed on them. Along with this, you should also know that no such taxation was imposed in Britain itself. It was only on the colonists that Britain relied to make up for the immense war expenses. Now, if I ask you the question, when was the Stamp Act passed, will you be able to answer it? Was it in 1765, 1768, 1766 or 1767? Yes, you are right. The Stamp Act was passed in 1765. Now, what happened after this stamp tax was imposed on the colonists? The colonists rose in rebellion against this act. They were protesting on the streets against this arbitrary act. Why is it so? They mentioned that since they have no representatives in the British Parliament, the British government too did not have any right to impose this sort of an arbitrary tax on them. They demanded that the British government should repeal this tax at the earliest. Along with this, they raised the slogan, "No taxation without representation." Now, what does that mean? That means that as long as the colonists don't get to send their own representatives to the British Parliament, the British government too did not have any right to impose any taxes on them. What did the colonists do? They rose in rebellion against this act and they refrained from paying this tax. The uprisings, the colonial protests also reached a violent proportion in some cases. The American colonists were so enraged that they strongly resented the imposition of this tax on them, which is why they formed the Stamp Act Congress. That is to say, people from all the 13 colonies came together with one shared interest, with one shared enemy. What was that enemy? The British government. Now, do you think the British government finally listened to these protests, listened to the rebellious masses and what they had to say against the imposition of these taxes? Yes. After a year, the Stamp Act was repealed by the British government because huge masses rose in rebellion against this one act. But does that mean the British government put an end to imposing taxes on its colonies? Do you think so? Definitely not. It is at this juncture that the British Parliament realized that if it repealed all the taxes, the Parliament would never be taken seriously by the colonists. This would also render the British government incapable from extorting further taxes from the colonies. So, in the year 1767, the British government imposed a whole series of taxes on a lot of consumer goods. Consumer goods in the likes of paper, tea, glass and paint. Together, these acts were called the Townshend Acts, and this was named after the prominent British parliamentarian called Charles Townshend. I guess this reminds you of how the colonists rose in rebellion against the British government when the Stamp Act was imposed on them. Similar to that, in this case as well, the colonists rose in rebellion together against the imposition of the Townshend Acts. They believed that if they have no representative in the British Parliament, the British government should not be imposing taxes on them. In the former case, we have seen how the colonists' rebellion eventually compelled the British government to repeal the Stamp Act. So in this case as well, the colonists believed that if they can rise in rebellion, the British government will also repeal these acts. What happened after this? Masses were violently protesting the imposition of these acts. In fact, in some cases, the uprisings, the protests went to a great extent. The tax collectors were often beaten. Some tax collectors were compelled to drink tea, to paint their own bodies, and even walk on glass. Following these demonstrations and these protests, the British government also opened fire on these rebellious colonists. But they were not to be dominated that time. The protests still went on. Finally, after some time, the British government realized that this time as well, it had to repeal the Townshend Acts. Most of the Townshend Acts were repealed except one. Can you tell me which product was it that was still heavily taxed by the British government? The product that was still heavily taxed by the British government was tea. So among all the Townshend Acts, it was only the tax on tea that was not repealed by the British government. But don't you think there is some specific reason behind it? Why would the British government do so? It was repealing the taxes on other consumer goods, but why was it still imposing taxes on tea? To understand that, we have to discuss how important tea was. To understand the importance of tea, we would have to go back to the 1700s. Tea was one of the major trading commodities in the 1700s. Tea was grown in China and it was traded to Europe through India. Now, why was tea so important? Tea has always been a very popular drink among the Europeans. The colonists who had settled in North America were essentially Europeans. So they could not let go of their love for tea even when they settled in a different continent. By the 1760s, America was consuming more than 1 million pounds of tea every year. Can you imagine that? Since tea was a very important trading commodity between Britain and its colonies, Britain devised this strategy. It understood that if it still levied taxes on tea, it would gain huge revenue from this. Now this goes without saying that this unfair taxation on tea was resented by the colonists. They found this very unfair since tea was a very popular drink among them. So what happened after this? What shape did this resentment of the colonists take? This time as well, the colonists rose in rebellion, but the British Parliament did not listen to them. Tea was primarily shipped to America through the sea routes, and these ships reached the port cities. One such port city was the city of Boston. On the 16th of December 1773, 3 ships carrying lots and lots of tea had reached the city of Boston. The governor of Boston ordered that the ship be unloaded there. The colonists were rebelling, but the governor did not listen to them. It is then that few colonists disguised as American Indians boarded the ship and started throwing all the tea in the sea. This act of defiance later came to be known as the Boston Tea Party. Having discussed this Boston Tea Party in considerable detail, we can now understand that this infamous Boston Tea Party was the primary reason that led to the outbreak of the American War of Independence. To understand the American War of Independence in greater detail, we would also have to delve deeper into the events that pertain to this war. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million plus questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it's rewarding too. So register for free now.